She kicked her poor mom out of her wedding, then the billionaire arrived and knelt before her, calling her the Queen. Chapter 1. The betrayal. Next, the Grand Celestine Hotel had never looked more magnificent. 500 white roses cascaded from ceiling arches that stretched 40 feet high. Crystal chandeliers caught the afternoon light and scattered it like broken diamonds across the marble floors. A string quartet played Pachelbel's canon in a corner, so elegant it looked like a painting come to life. Every guest wore designer labels. Every smile was practiced. Every detail had been curated, controlled, and calculated to project one singular message to the world. Vivienne Acafer had arrived, and she had no intention of letting anyone forget it. Vivienne stood before the floor-length mirror in the bridal suite, turning slowly, examining herself the way a sculptor examines a masterpiece. Her gown, a Monique Lhuillier original, $47,000, hugged her figure with architectural precision. Her hair, pinned back in an arrangement that had taken 3 stylists 4 hours to construct, crowned her head like something royal. Her diamond earrings alone could have paid 3 months' rent on the apartment where she had grown up. She did not think about that apartment today. She refused to. "You look absolutely flawless," said Camille, her maid of honor, pressing manicured fingers to her own collarbone in theatrical admiration. Camille was the wife of a hedge fund manager. She had met Vivienne 18 months ago at a charity gala and had decided, immediately and decisively, that Vivienne was worth knowing. "Damien is going to lose his mind when he sees you." Vivienne smiled the smile she had spent years perfecting. Controlled, luminous, betraying nothing that lived underneath. "He'd better," she said. Damien Ashworth was 38, Stanford-educated, heir to the Ashworth Group, a real estate and private equity empire that managed assets across 4 continents. He was handsome in the sharp, geometric way that wealth tends to produce, with gray-green eyes and the kind of casual confidence that comes from never once having doubted that the world would rearrange itself to accommodate him. He had chosen Vivienne. And Vivienne, brilliant, ambitious, breathtakingly beautiful Vivienne, who had clawed her way from nothing with nothing but her own intelligence, and a ferocious refusal to stay where she had started, had chosen him right back. Today was the convergence of everything she had engineered her life to become. Nothing was going to interrupt it. A soft knock at the door. Then another. Then a voice so familiar it landed somewhere deep in Vivienne's chest like a stone dropped into still water. "Vivienne. Baby, it's Mama." "Can I come in?" The room changed. It was subtle, no one else would have noticed, but Vivienne's shoulders moved a fraction of an inch upward. Her jaw set. The luminous smile did not vanish exactly, but something behind it switched off, the way a lamp dims when the power fluctuates. She looked at Camille. Then at Jade, her personal assistant, who was standing near the window with a clipboard. Both women read the expression on Vivienne's face with the practiced fluency of people who had learned, quickly, never to question it. "Handle it," Jade said, already moving toward the door. She opened it a crack, positioning her body so that the person outside could not see into the room and could not enter. Through the narrow gap, a woman was visible. She wore a pale blue dress, clean, pressed, but clearly purchased from a department store, not a boutique. Her hair was done with the careful effort of someone who had tried very hard, working with what she had. Her face was round and warm, carrying the particular softness of a woman who has lived through enormous difficulty and emerged from it not hardened but deepened. Her eyes, dark, gentle, luminous, searched the sliver of space Jade permitted, hopping to find her daughter. Her name was Adiz Acafer. Most people called her Ada. She was 53 years old. She had, at various points in her life, cleaned hotel rooms, worked overnight shifts at a canning factory, delivered meals for a catering service, and tutored neighborhood children in math from her kitchen table for $5 an hour. She spoke 3 languages with accents in all of them. She had once, long ago, been sentenced to 4 years in a federal correctional facility for a financial crime she had not committed. She had served 2.5 of those years before early release. She had never told her daughter she was innocent. She had never told her daughter anything except, "Study hard, be better. Don't let this neighborhood be your ceiling." And Vivienne had listened, and Vivienne had climbed, and today, at the summit of everything she had climbed toward, Vivienne did not want her mother in the room, Ms. Ackaffer, Jade said, through the narrow gap. In the smooth, professionally neutral tone she had been trained to use, Vivienne is in the final stages of preparation. She asked that family members please take their seats in the main hall. I just want 1 minute, Ada said. Her voice was quiet, not demanding, just hoping, just to see her, to tell her she'll see you at the ceremony. Your seat is reserved. Second row, left side, a pause. Ada's eyes moved past Jade's shoulder, trying once more to find her daughter's face in the room behind her. She couldn't see Vivienne. She couldn't know that Vivienne was standing 10 feet away, perfectly still, staring at her own reflection, choosing in this moment, with the precision she applied to every decision, not to turn around. Okay, Ada said finally, softly. Okay, tell her I love her. Jade smiled, professional and impenetrable. Of course. The door closed. Vivienne let out a breath she hadn't admitted she was holding. She's sweet, Camille offered carefully. She is. Vivienne agreed in a tone that closed the subject entirely. The ceremony was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. The vows were eloquent. The flowers were extraordinary. The officiant had married 2 senators and a tech billionaire. When Damien slid the ring onto Vivienne's finger, 3 carats, emerald cut, set in platinum, there was an audible collective intake of breath from 500 guests. Ada sat in the second row, left side, and watched. She watched her daughter promise forever to a man she had met only twice. She watched the photographers capture every angle of the moment. She watched the light fall through the cathedral windows and make Vivienne look, for just a second, like something sacred. She cried quietly, as mothers do, pressing a folded tissue to the corners of her eyes. She did not know that she had already been removed from the seating chart for the reception dinner. She found out when the reception began. The wedding coordinator, a woman named Serena in a severe black blazer, approached Ada as guests were being directed from the ceremony space to the reception hall. She did it efficiently, with a rehearsed gentleness that made it clear she had been given specific instructions. Mrs. Ackaffer, I need to show you to your seating. Ada followed her, expecting to be taken to the main hall where the round tables with elaborate centerpieces waited. Instead, she was guided down a side corridor, into an anteroom. A small, pleasant anteroom. There were flowers on the table, and the food was the same as the main reception. But it held only 2 other tables, occupied by a few distant relatives and the caterers taking their break. It was separated from the main hall by 2 closed doors and 20 feet of marble corridor. Ada stood in the center of it and understood. She understood without being told. She understood with the clean, clear comprehension of a woman who has been diminished by the world so many times that she has learned to recognize the architecture of exclusion instantly. She had been removed, tucked away, hidden, because of the record, because of what she was, because of who her daughter needed not to be associated with. She sat down at the table near the window. She unfolded her napkin carefully and placed it in her lap, the way she had taught Vivienne to do when Vivienne was 7 years old and they were practicing manners at their second-hand kitchen table with its wobbly leg. She ate her dinner quietly. She did not cry. Not then. She looked out the window at the manicured garden, where the late afternoon sun was turning the hedges gold, and she prayed, the way she always prayed, not for herself, but for the child she had spent her entire life protecting. Lord, let her be happy. Even if she can't let me be near the happiness, let her be happy. At the main reception in the grand hall, the family photos were being taken. Vivienne stood between Damien's parents, his father, Harrison Ashworth, silver-haired and patrician, his mother, Gloria, in a champagne Chanel suit, while the photographer directed the arrangement. Beautiful. The photographer called. Now any other family joining? No, Vivienne said quickly. This is everyone. Camille, standing nearby, glanced toward the side corridor. She had seen where the coordinator had taken Ada. She said nothing. She filed it away, but someone else had seen it too. A man standing near the entrance to the main hall, slightly apart from the other guests, tall, silver-templed, wearing a suit that, to a trained eye, cost more than most cars. He had arrived late and slipped in quietly, which is the particular gift of people who possess enough power that they no longer feel compelled to announce themselves. His name was Edmund Voss. He was 61 years old and he was, by any measure that the world uses to assess such things, extraordinarily wealthy. He ran a private equity conglomerate that operated across 12 countries. His name was not in tabloids, he preferred it that way. But it was in boardrooms, in whispered conversations, in the particular way other powerful people's voices changed when they said it. He had known Ada Ackafer for 30 years. He had been her employer once long ago when she was a cleaning supervisor at a building his company managed. He had watched her work. He had watched her study. He had watched her, methodically and quietly, become the best version of whatever room she was in. He had tried to help her once when the legal trouble came. He hadn't been able to. That was a debt he had carried for decades. He looked at the anteroom where Ada had been seated. He looked at the main hall, at the family photo being taken without her. His expression did not change. He simply turned and walked back out the main entrance. He took out his phone. He made 3 calls. He was building something. And it would be ready, he calculated, in precisely the amount of time it would take for the bride to fully understand what she had done. Chapter 2. The Secret History 18 years earlier. The apartment on Clement Street was narrow and smelled of the fried plantains Ada had made for dinner, and the Murphy's oil soap she used on Saturdays to clean the hardwood floors she'd salvaged from a renovation down the block. It had 2 bedrooms, one for Ada, one for Vivienne, and a kitchen where they did everything: homework, prayer, arguments, laughter, long silences that held more love than most conversations. Vivienne was 15. She had found a way to make money, not a legal way. It had started small. She'd been approached by a senior at school, a boy named Terrence who wore clothes that cost too much and spoke with the particular confidence of someone who had figured out something the adults hadn't. He needed someone to make deposits, small amounts, different banks, different days, nothing that would flag. He said it was harmless. He said the people whose money it was were just avoiding taxes, nothing dramatic, just business. Vivienne, who was brilliant and hungry and furious at the arithmetic of her life, had said yes. She had done it for 4 months before it collapsed. When the federal investigators came to the school, Terrence had vanished. Completely. There was no sign he had ever existed. Wrong name, wrong address, gone. The chain of deposits traced back carefully to the accounts Vivienne had used. To Vivienne, who was 15, Ada had come to the school. She had sat in the principal's office with a federal agent and a school counselor, and she had listened without moving, without crying, as they explained what her daughter had done. Then she had asked everyone to leave the room except Vivienne. She had looked at her daughter for a long time. Then she had said very quietly, "Tell me everything." Vivienne had, all of it. Shaking, crying, terrified not of prison but of her mother's face, which held something more devastating than anger. It held grief. When Vivienne finished, Ada had sat in silence for 1 full minute. Then she had said, "You're going to sit here. You're going to say nothing. I'm going to go speak to the agent." "Mama, what are you?" Vivienne. Ada's voice, usually gentle, had become something else, not hard but absolute, the way stone is absolute. "You are going to college. You are going to have the life I have been working for since before you were born. This thing, this mistake, it is not going to take that from you. Do you understand me, Mama? You understand me?" Vivienne had been silent. Ada had walked out of the room. She had told the agent that she had been the one making the deposits, that her daughter had no knowledge, that it was her operation, her accounts, her crime. They hadn't fully believed her. The evidence was complicated, inconclusive. But the agent was a practical man with a full caseload, and Ada's confession, combined with her willingness to cooperate on identifying other network participants, had been enough to close the file on the minor involved. Ada had been sentenced to 4 years. She had served 2.5. Vivienne had been told that her mother had been caught in a bad situation, a vague, terrible phrase that Vivienne had been 15 and frightened enough to accept. She had gone to live with Ada's sister during those years. She had studied. She had worked. She had channeled every ounce of her shame and grief and fear into academic achievement, the way Ada had told her to. She had never asked, specifically, what the situation had been. Part of her had not wanted to know. Part of her, buried deep, had always been afraid that if she asked the real question, she would hear the real answer, and the real answer would require something from her that she was not sure she could give. During those years, in the correctional facility in Northern California, Ada had taken every educational program available to her. She had earned a certificate in bookkeeping. She had improved her English, not that it needed much improvement, but she had polished it methodically, the way she polished everything, working through a second-hand grammar workbook by the light from the hallway that came under her cell door after lights out. She had written letters to Vivienne. Long letters, full of encouragement and recipes and little observations about the world that she thought might be useful someday. She had never written about her own circumstances. She had written about Vivienne's future as if it were already certain, already real, already happening. Vivienne had kept every letter. They were in a box in the back of her closet. She had not opened the box in 6 years. After her release, Ada had worked her way back with characteristic quiet ferocity. She had found work as a bookkeeper for a small nonprofit, then for a slightly larger one, then for a community development organization that operated affordable housing in 3 neighborhoods. She was good at the work, meticulous, trustworthy, with an instinct for patterns in numbers that her supervisors frequently marveled at. She lived simply. She saved carefully. She built a small, clean life in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Richmond district, where she kept a window box of marigolds and cooked Sunday dinners large enough for whoever might be hungry. She had never stopped believing in her daughter. Not when Vivienne graduated college with honors and did not come home to celebrate with her too busy mama. There's a firm party. Not when Vivienne got her first corporate job and did not invite her to the office holiday event. It's a work thing. You wouldn't know anyone. Not when Vivienne started dating Damien and brought him home once, briefly, formally, and watched his eyes move around Ada's apartment with that particular flicker of polite assessment. Not even now. Not even here in this anteroom, eating alone. Ada believed in her daughter the way she believed in the sun, not because she had earned it in this moment, but because it was simply the nature of things. The sun would rise. Vivienne would, eventually, find her way home. Ada was patient. She had learned how to be. Chapter 3. The karma turn. The Ashworth estate in Marin County was a statement about the kind of wealth that no longer feels compelled to explain itself. 12,000 square feet of Pacific-facing glass and California oak, staffed by a household team of 7, with a wine cellar that had been written up in 3 architectural magazines, and a kitchen that had been designed by a chef who had 2 Michelin stars. The gardens were maintained by a horticulturalist who drove up from San Francisco 3 times a week. Vivienne had moved in after the wedding, as planned. For the first 3 months, it had felt like what she had imagined. Damien was attentive when he was present, which was less often than she'd expected. Gloria, his mother, was gracious in the procedural way of a woman who has decided to accept an outcome she didn't choose, and to make her acceptance very clearly conditional. The first fracture appeared at the Ashworth family dinner, a monthly institution, held on the second Sunday, attended by Damien's parents. His 2 brothers with their wives and various family friends whose names Vivienne was still learning. She had dressed carefully. She had prepared. She had not been prepared for Gloria, Vivienne. Gloria had smiled across the long mahogany table with an expression that was technically warm but functionally taxonomical, the smile of a woman cataloging what she was dealing with. I've been meaning to ask. Your people, are they from the Bay Area originally? Your people. Vivienne had felt the phrase land. She had smoothed her napkin across her lap, the way her mother had taught her, and said, pleasantly, my mother came from Nigeria. She's lived in San Francisco for about 25 years. Gloria had tilted her head. I didn't see her much at the wedding. Very quiet woman, she's private. A pause employed with surgical precision. That's interesting, because I'd heard she had a history, some kind of legal situation. The table had not gone silent. The conversation around them continued. But Vivienne had felt in her own chest the precise sensation of a trapdoor opening beneath her, the same vertigo she used to feel as a child when she sensed, suddenly, that the adults around her were operating from a set of facts she didn't have access to. It was a long time ago, Vivienne said. It was resolved. Of course, Gloria had said warmly. These things happen, in certain kinds of families. She had lifted her wine glass and said, to the man beside her, something about the Napa vintage, and the subject had moved on. But it hadn't moved on. It had simply gone underground. Over the following months, Vivienne began to understand, with the slow, nauseating clarity of watching a picture develop, what her life in this family was going to be. She was accepted in the technical sense. The marriage was legal, the ring was real, the last name had been appended to hers. But she was accepted the way a piece of furniture is accepted, placed, acknowledged, permitted to remain, but never quite belonging. At social events, Gloria introduced her to people with the faint, almost imperceptible hesitation that said, "She's Damien's choice, we're being supportive." At family discussions about the Ashworth Group, Vivienne's suggestions, informed, intelligent, frequently excellent, were received with polite smiles and then quietly shelved. When Damien's oldest brother made a joke at dinner about marrying up, he'd been looking at Vivienne when he said it, and laughed as if he'd meant it as a compliment. She had smiled. She was very good at smiling. But at night, in the marble bathroom of the room she shared with a husband who was increasingly in New York on business, she would stand at the sink and look at her own face and feel something she had no language for, a hollowness that luxury could not fill, an echo in rooms that should have felt like a rival. The moment it crystallized was a Tuesday afternoon in November. Vivienne had come downstairs to find Gloria in the main living room with two women from her charitable foundation board. They hadn't heard her on the stairs. She had heard Gloria's voice, clear and conversational, lovely girl, really, very driven. But you know what the problem is with women who come from nothing? They spend their whole lives performing the version of themselves they think we want to see. They're never quite real. Never quite at home anywhere. Damien means well, but I do worry. Vivienne had stood on the stairs and listened to herself being described like a simulation, like a performance of a person rather than a person. She had turned around and gone back upstairs. She had sat on the edge of the bed in the 12,000 square foot estate in Marin County, and she had thought, for the first time in a long time, with the kind of raw, unfiltered honesty that only ambushes you in silence, about her mother. About the second row left side, about the anteroom, about the folded napkin and the window and the marigolds in the window box and the letters in a box in the back of a closet she had not opened in 6 years, about a woman who had spent her whole life being hidden, diminished, tucked away, categorized by a record that told nothing of the truth, and she had understood, with a completeness that broke her open. She had done this. She had built this machine. And now she was standing inside it, being processed by it, and the machine was her. She was Gloria. She had always been Gloria. The marriage did not end dramatically. It ended the way certain structures end, not in collapse, but in a slow, clarifying recognition that the foundation was never there. Damien was not a villain. He was, in many ways, genuinely decent, kind in the individual moments, well-intentioned in the broad strokes. But he had been raised inside a system of stratification as immovable and natural to him as weather, and he had never had any reason to question it. And Vivienne had never, in all their time together, been honest enough with him or with herself to name what she actually was, and where she had actually come from, and what that meant. She had built their relationship on the same performance Gloria had described on those stairs. When she finally tried to speak honestly about her mother, about the record, about what she had done at the wedding, Damien had listened carefully. He had said the right things. He had expressed the appropriate sympathies. But in his eyes she had seen something she now recognized. The look of a person encountering information that doesn't fit into their existing model of you and deciding quietly that the model is more comfortable than the information. "You're being very hard on yourself," he had said. "I'm being accurate," she had said. They had lasted 4 more months after that conversation. Chapter 4. The return. It was raining when Vivienne came back. Not the performative, cinematic rain of movies, not a downpour with lightning and drama. Just the quiet, persistent San Francisco rain, the kind that comes in sideways from the bay and makes everything smell like salt and wet concrete and something older underneath. She had one suitcase. She had left most of what was in that house behind. The clothes, the jewelry, the curated life, she'd left most of it, because it belonged to a version of her that she was finished performing. The apartment building on Clement Street was the same building, Different Unit Ada had moved to the second floor after the old super had died and the new one had offered her first pick of the vacancies. But the same neighborhood, the same fog, the same marigolds in the window box, visible from the sidewalk below. Vivienne stood on the sidewalk for a long moment with rain on her face, looking up at the lit window. She had not called ahead. She had started to, several times, and each time she had put the phone down because she did not know what she would say. "I'm sorry" felt catastrophically inadequate. "I've changed" felt like something a person says who hasn't yet proven it. And everything else was too large, too dense, too freighted with years of accumulated weight to compress into a phone call in a parking garage while her hands were shaking. She went upstairs. She knocked. She heard her mother's footsteps, that particular rhythm, familiar to some ancient part of Vivienne's nervous system. The rhythm of the woman who had gotten up before dawn every morning of Vivienne's childhood to make sure there was something hot to eat before school. The rhythm of the woman who had walked every corridor of every trouble Vivienne had ever found and come out the other side still walking, still intact, still reaching. The door opened. Ada stood in the light of the hallway wearing her housecoat and slippers, hair wrapped for bed. She had been reading. There was a book in her hand. She looked at her daughter, the rain-soaked hair, the single suitcase, the ruined mascara, the expression of a person who has traveled very far to arrive at the place they started and found that the place they started was where they needed to be. Ada said nothing. She opened the door wider. She put down the book. She wrapped both arms around her daughter and held her with the full, unhesitating, unconditional strength of a woman who had been waiting for this return, not with resentment, but with the quiet, unshakable certainty that it would come. Vivienne, who had been managing herself for years, who had controlled every expression and engineered every impression, and walled off every vulnerable corner of herself behind performance and ambition, came apart completely. She cried in a way she had not cried since she was a child. Not gracefully, not quietly. The way you cry when something that has been held too long is finally let go, messy, total, cellular. Ada held her, said nothing, just held her in the doorway in the rain sound until the crying slowed and Vivienne could breathe again. Then she said, finally, gently, "Come inside. I made groundnut soup." "You still like groundnut soup?" Vivienne laughed, the fractured, watery laugh of someone who had just cried hard enough that laughter and crying feel like the same thing. "I still like groundnut soup," she said. They went inside. The days that followed were not dramatic. That was their power. There were no grand confessional scenes, no explosive confrontations, no choreographed moments of healing. Instead, there was the work of ordinary life conducted in proximity: cooking, eating, cleaning, sitting on the small porch with tea while the fog rolled in from the bay. They talked, but not all at once. The conversation was like a river finding its way, not forced, not flooded, but persistent, finding the path. On the third morning, Vivienne woke early and came to the kitchen to find Ada already there, sitting at the table with her coffee and a small notebook where she kept her household accounts. Vivienne sat across from her, looked at her mother in the early light, the gray at her temples, the careful dignity of her posture, the hands that had cleaned and cooked and written letters and scraped together every resource available to make a daughter's future. "Mama," she said. Ada looked up. "At the wedding." Vivienne stopped, started again. "What I did at the wedding, I need to. You don't have to. I do." Vivienne pressed forward, not letting herself retreat into the comfortable offer. "I put you in that room because I was ashamed. Not of you. Of myself, of where I came from, of what I was afraid people would think when they looked at you and at me and put them together." She exhaled. "I turned you into something to hide instead of someone to honor, and that's the worst thing I've ever done. It's the worst thing I've ever been." Ada was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You want to know something?" Vivienne looked at her. "I have known, since you were 6 years old, that you were going to do something big with your life. I knew it the way I know my own name. And I also knew, I have always known, that the road to that big life was going to ask you some very hard questions about who you are, about what your worth is really built on." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "The wedding was not the worst thing you've ever done. The worst thing you've ever done was to decide, somewhere along the way, that your worth was something you had to earn from other people. that your story was something to hide rather than something to understand. Vivienne felt this land in the exact center of her. I wasn't hiding my story, she said slowly. I was hiding yours, Ada nodded. Yes, because if I'd told your story, the real one, I would have had to say what it cost you. And if I said what it cost you, I would have had to say what it was for. Vivienne's voice was barely a sound. I would have had to say that I was the reason you, Vivienne. No, let me finish. The reason I never really asked what happened. The reason I just accepted the vague story and didn't push. I think I always knew. I think some part of me always knew, and I chose not to know because knowing would have meant living inside the truth of it, Ada said simply. Yes, and that is a very heavy thing to live inside. How did you do it? Vivienne asked. All those years, all of it. How did you not hate me for it? Ada looked at her daughter for a long, full moment. Because you are my daughter, she said. Not the daughter you became when you were climbing and performing and hiding. The daughter who used to fall asleep in my arms watching bad television on that broken couch in the old apartment. The daughter who cried when she read The Velveteen Rabbit because she wanted everything to be real. That daughter was always in there. I just had to wait. Vivienne reached across the table, took her mother's hands, held them. Chapter 5. The new purpose, the Cornerstone Women's Resource Center, occupied the ground floor of a converted Victorian on Mission Street, wedged between a laundromat and a Filipino grocery. It had mint green walls and mismatched chairs donated from various office clearingouts, and a coffee maker that worked 70% of the time, and a staff of 3 full-time employees, 2 part-time volunteers, and a revolving door of women who came in carrying various configurations of crisis and left carrying, hopefully, something usable. Vivienne had found it by accident. 6 weeks after returning to her mother's apartment, still in the early, uncertain stage of rebuilding herself, she had walked past it on her way to the grocery store and seen a sign in the window. Financial Literacy Workshop, Tuesdays, 6 p.m. All welcome. She had stopped. She had gone in on Tuesday. She had sat in the back row and listened as a soft-spoken woman explained compound interest and credit scores to a room of 11 women who ranged in age from 22 to 61, and who were all, in various ways, trying to understand how money worked so that it could work for them rather than against them. Vivienne had listened for 40 minutes. Then the facilitator had gotten confused on a question about the difference between secured and unsecured debt, and Vivienne had, without entirely planning to, leaned forward and explained it. Clearly, precisely. With 2 examples and a diagram she drew on the back of a handout. The room had looked at her. The facilitator had looked at her. Do you work in finance? She'd asked. I have, Vivienne had said. I do. I mean, yes. The facilitator's name was Priya. She ran the center with the specific, magnificent tenacity of a person who is perpetually under-resourced and perpetually unwilling to accept that as a reason not to proceed. She had hired 3 staff members, a lawyer on a pro bono retainer, and a rotating cast of volunteers on a budget that would have embarrassed a mid-sized lemonade stand. She needed help, constantly. Vivienne had started coming in on Tuesdays, then Thursdays, then most weekday mornings. She led the financial literacy workshops. She helped women construct budgets, understand their credit reports, navigate the paperwork architecture of public benefits and workforce programs and housing applications. She talked with women who had been incarcerated about reentry, what was possible, what wasn't, what the documents looked like, what rights they had that the forms didn't mention. She knew about that last one from her mother. She was learning as much as she was teaching. At first, she kept herself professional, facilitator mode, clean, helpful, impersonal, the version of herself that had operated in conference rooms for years, the version that delivered information without revealing the information source. It was Priya who changed that. They need to know you're one of them, Priya said, one afternoon over terrible coffee in the small back office. Not literally, I mean in the sense that you've been in a version of what they're in. Otherwise, you're just another person from outside coming in to help, and outside people, however well-meaning, are a different category. I'm a different category, Vivienne said. You're the daughter of a woman with a record who grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Richmond and made it into corporate finance before everything fell apart, and you had to come back and figure out who you actually were, Priya said, matter-of-factly. That is not a different category. That is exactly the category. Vivienne was quiet. What happened to the marriage? One of the women in the workshop had asked her, once not rudely, just with the direct, practical curiosity of a woman who has learned that the details of other women's struggles are frequently instructive. Vivienne had given her usual answer. It didn't work out. Polished, contained. The woman had nodded, unimpressed. What did you leave behind? Vivienne had looked at her. Everything I thought I needed. And then what? And then I went home. The woman had nodded again, differently this time, with the recognition of someone who has made a similar journey or is standing at the edge of needing to. After that, Vivienne had started telling more of the truth. Incrementally, progressively, not as performance or trauma sharing but as information. Here is what I did. Here is what it cost. Here is what I learned from the cost. Here are the practical, applicable, usable things I know now that I did not know before I had to learn them from the inside of my own failure. The women at Cornerstone received this differently than she'd expected. Not with pity or judgment or the particular discomfort of people encountering a status fall narrative. With asterisk recognition. With the relief of people who have been told their stories are shameful and are encountering, finally, someone with a similar story who is not ashamed. One afternoon, a woman named Deshonda, 34 years old, 18 months out of a sentence for fraud, trying to get her children back, had sat across from Vivienne in the resource library and said, "How did you stop being embarrassed? Of your mom? Of where you come from?" Vivienne had thought about this for a moment. "I stopped thinking of it as something that happened to me," she said, "and started thinking of it as something that made me. But what if it made you into something you don't want to be? Then you figure out which parts of what it made you are worth keeping," Vivienne said, "and you build on those. The rest was never really you anyway." Ada had begun coming to the center on Fridays. She helped with a practical life skills workshop, cooking on a budget, grocery planning, the small logistics of household management that are never formally taught and are, in their way, as important as anything formal. She did it with the ease of a woman doing what she has always done, except now the context had a name and the labor had witnesses. Watching her mother in that room, watching Ada show a 26-year-old how to make 3 meals out of one piece of chicken, moving between the camp stove they'd set up on the folding table, and the stack of printed recipe cards she'd made herself with careful hand lettering, Vivienne felt something shift in her chest that she didn't have a word for. Not guilt, exactly. Not grief. Something more like correction, the sensation of something returning to the right alignment after years of being slightly off. This is who she is, Vivienne thought. This is what I was ashamed of. A woman who knows how to make something out of nothing, who has spent her entire life doing it, and who does it without bitterness, without performance, without needing anyone to validate that it is extraordinary. She took out her phone and took a photo. She kept it. Edmund Voss had been watching quietly. He had contacts at the Cornerstone Center. He funded a number of community organizations in the Bay Area through his family foundation, with the deliberate anonymity of someone who has learned that visible philanthropy tends to be about the donor rather than the recipient. He had heard about the woman who had come in and started leading financial literacy workshops. He had confirmed who she was. He had let time pass. He was in no hurry. He had a plan, and the plan would be better if Vivienne came to it as herself rather than as someone still in the process of becoming herself. He gave it 4 more months. Then he made a phone call to a member of the board of the Bay Area Women's Economic Empowerment Summit, an annual conference that convened funders, policymakers, and practitioners in the nonprofit and workforce development space. He had a speaker suggestion, he said. 2 speakers, actually. Chapter 6. Public Honor. The Civic Auditorium on Grove Street held 1,200 people and had, over the decades, accommodated symphony performances, political rallies, and exactly one extremely chaotic indoor farmers market that everyone agreed was a good idea in theory. Tonight it held the Bay Area Women's Economic Empowerment Summit's annual gala, which was, in the specific social lexicon of people who attended such things, a significant event. Not flashy in the wedding of a woman trying to prove something way. Significant in the way of rooms that contain people who actually change how things work, gathered together to acknowledge it. Vivienne had been told she was speaking on a panel about financial literacy and community-based economic programs. She had prepared accordingly. She had not been told she was the keynote. She found out from Priya, who appeared at the door of the speaker's green room 40 minutes before the program began with the expression of someone delivering news that is both excellent and alarming. "They want you to open the main program," Priya said. Vivienne stared at her. The panel's still happening, but before the panel they want a keynote speaker. 10 to 12 minutes. They said. Priya consulted her phone. They want someone who can speak to the intersection of personal narrative and systemic insight, with particular emphasis on the experience of women impacted by the criminal justice system. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. Who organized this? The board. Apparently a major donor made a suggestion. Vivienne looked at herself in the mirror of the green room. She was wearing a navy dress, simple, clean, nothing like the $47,000 gown of 2 years ago. Her hair was down. She looked like herself. She thought about Priya's words from months ago. "They need to know you're one of them." She thought about Deshanda's question. "How did you stop being embarrassed?" She thought about the photo on her phone of Ada at the camp stove, hand-lettered recipe cards, doing what she had always done. "Is my mother here?" she asked. "She's in the audience," Priya said. She thought she was just coming to watch the panel. Vivienne nodded. She breathed. She let herself feel the weight of what the next 12 minutes would cost her, and decided that the cost was worth paying and had, in fact, been owed for some time. "Okay," she said. She walked onto the stage to polite, conference-appropriate applause from 1,200 people who knew her name from the program but not yet from anywhere else. She stood at the podium. She looked out at the room, the tables with their white cloths, the faces, the quiet waiting attention of people who had come to be engaged and informed and, if they were lucky, moved. She found her mother in the crowd. Third row center. Ada, who had come to hear a panel and was now watching her daughter stand at a keynote podium in a 1,200-person room, sat with her hands in her lap and her face composed in that particular expression of hers, watchful, warm, waiting. Vivienne looked at her for 1 second. Then she began. "2 years ago, I was a bride in a $47,000 dress in a room that looked like it cost more than most people's entire lives. And my mother, who is sitting in this room right now, was in a side room, alone, eating dinner at a table by a window, because I had decided that her presence at my wedding was a liability. I had decided that because she had a criminal record, because she had served time in a federal correctional facility, because in the life I had built, the curated, constructed performance of a life I had built, there was no room for a woman who carried that particular history. What I didn't say out loud, even to myself, was the full truth. I was ashamed of my mother because I was ashamed of where I had come from. And I was ashamed of where I had come from because I had spent 15 years deciding that my worth was something I could buy my way into. That if I accumulated enough credentials, salary, status, the right last name, I could become a different kind of person. A person who had never been poor. A person whose family had never had a situation. A person who was, to use the word that kept circulating in my mind like a prayer, clean. I was not clean. I was, as it turned out, exactly as complicated and flawed and human as every single woman in this room. The only difference was that I had decided that my specific complications and flaws were too much to admit to. So I performed over them. I covered them. I seated them in a side room and served them dinner by a window and told myself that this was acceptable, that this was strategy, that this was what you had to do to get ahead. Asterisk, what I have learned at significant personal cost, which I am genuinely grateful for, is this: the things we hide don't disappear. They wait. And while they're waiting, they are quietly building the walls of the cage we're living inside. My mother's name is Adiz Akafar. She came to this country from Nigeria with almost nothing, which is a sentence I used to say with the specific pride of someone who has decided that immigrant struggle is acceptable source material for a success narrative as long as the struggle is kept tastefully vague. But here is what the vagueness was hiding. My mother spent 2.5 years in federal prison for a financial crime she did not commit. She committed it in the documentation because I committed it in fact, when I was 15 years old and afraid and making choices I had no business making. She went to the investigators and told them it was her. And because I was 15, and because she made me promise not to ask, and because the truth required something I was not ready to carry, she let me let her. Because she had decided, in the particular absolute way that she decides things, that my future was worth the cost. She spent those years in a correctional facility studying English grammar and bookkeeping by the light from under her cell door. She came out and built a small, clean, honest life. She wrote me letters every week that never mentioned her own circumstances and only ever spoke about my future. And I spent 20 years making myself over into someone who would never have to explain her. I am done with that project. My name is Vivienne Akafer. My mother is a woman with a record who worked 3 jobs and gave everything she had to give a daughter a life that daughter then used to be ashamed of her. That is the truth of where I come from. And where I come from is the reason I can stand here, not the credentials, not the salary, not the last name I've since removed from my own, but the woman who decided when I was 15 years old that my future was more important than her present. I am not self-made. I am mother-made. Every financial model I can explain, I explain with the logic she taught me at a kitchen table in a 2-bedroom apartment. Every resource I know how to find, I found because she showed me how to look. Every woman I have had the privilege of sitting across from at Cornerstone Center, I have been able to serve because I have finally stopped hiding the fact that I was once exactly where they are. My mother is in this room. She came tonight expecting to watch a panel. She has no idea I am about to ask her to come up to this stage, Mama. The room had gone very still. Ada in the 3rd row looked up at her daughter with an expression that moved through several things at once: surprise, recognition, the particular suspended breath of a person who is processing something that is both unexpected and in some deeper layer exactly what they have always known was coming. Mama, will you come up here? Ada rose. She moved down the row, excusing herself past seated guests, and walked up the aisle and up the short set of steps at the side of the stage. She was wearing the same kind of dress she'd worn to the wedding, clean, pressed, simple, carefully chosen. She walked the way she always walked, with the quiet, unhurried dignity of a woman who has never needed a room's permission to exist in it. When she reached Vivienne, Vivienne handed her a bouquet of marigolds. Ada looked at them. Marigolds, her marigolds. The ones she'd grown in the window box. She pressed her lips together. I spent a long time, Vivienne said into the microphone, but looking only at her mother, thinking that what you gave me was something I needed to overcome, something to escape from. I understand now that what you gave me was everything worth keeping. She paused. I am so sorry it took me this long to say that to you, in front of everyone, in the light, where you belong. Ada put her free hand on her daughter's face. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The room, which had been very still, came apart. In the 4th row, 3 seats to the right of center, Edmund Voss sat with his hands folded in his lap and watched. His expression was not one of triumph or satisfaction. It was simpler than that. It was the expression of a man settling a very old account, not a debt he had owed exactly, but a debt that had existed in the world, a debt that the world had failed to pay, and that the world was paying now. After the applause had slowed, he rose from his seat. He moved toward the stage. He moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who has been in many rooms and understands the rhythms of them. He stepped onto the stage not dramatically, not commandingly, and the room, which had been returning to its normal ambient noise, went quiet again. He stood before Ada Akafer. He looked at her for a moment. Then slowly, with the full deliberateness of a man doing precisely what he intends to do, Edmund Voss, founder of the Voss Group, manager of assets across 12 countries, a man who had not bent his knee to anything in 30 years of professional life, went down on one knee before her. The room was absolutely silent. Mrs. Akafer, he said, clearly enough to be heard. My name is Edmund Voss. You worked for a building I managed on Mission Street in 1991. You were the best employee in that building. I have spent 30 years wishing I had done more when you needed someone to do more." He paused. "I am doing it now very late, and I am asking your forgiveness for the lateness." Ada looked at him. She said quietly, "Get up, please." He rose. "I forgave that a long time ago," she said. "I forgave everyone a long time ago. It's the only way I know how to stay light enough to keep going." He nodded. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope, simple, white, cream-colored paper. "I run a foundation," he said, "that funds community organizations working with women impacted by the justice system. I would like Cornerstone Center to be in that portfolio. And I would like to establish, if you'll permit it, a scholarship in your name for women in workforce reentry programs." He held out the envelope. "The particulars are in here. Nothing is required of you except your name on it if you want your name on it. And your daughter's involvement, if she's willing." Ada looked at the envelope. She looked at Vivienne. She looked at the room. Then with the same pragmatic grace she brought to everything, she took the envelope. "I'll review it with Priya," she said. The room laughed, surprised, relieved, delighted. The kind of laughter that comes when the culmination of an emotional sequence reveals that the person at the center of it is not a symbol but a person, specific and practical and entirely themselves. Vivienne laughed too. She put her arm around her mother's shoulders. They stood together at the podium, Ada with her marigolds and her envelope and her quiet dignity, Vivienne with her arm around the woman she had spent 2 years learning to stop running from, and the room held them both in the light where they had always belonged, not despite everything, but because of it. Later, much later, after the event had ended and the auditorium had emptied and the cleanup crew was stacking chairs and the last of the guests were making their way to their cars in the cool San Francisco night, Vivienne and Ada walked together down Grove Street. They walked slowly. "There was no hurry. You practiced that speech," Ada said. "I did," Vivienne agreed. "For how long? 2 weeks." Ada nodded, considering this. "The marigolds were a nice touch." "I thought so." A pause. Their footsteps on the wet sidewalk. The bay fog coming in the way it always did, making everything soft and close. "I have something to tell you," Ada said. Vivienne looked at her. "I was always proud of you," Ada said simply. "Not of what you built, of you. The part underneath all the building. I always knew that part was there." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. And she did. She finally, fully, without reservation or asterisk or caveat, she knew. They walked on through the fog, mother and daughter, toward home. Please subscribe, like, share, turn on notifications so you never miss a story. The ENDNEXT.